Welcome back to Proxy Hammer, everybody. And today we're going to be talking about Eldar Warlocks in the new 9th edition Codex and what role they play in the new Codex. So basically, Warlocks and Seer Councils and stuff like that have been in the game for a long time. And they've gone through various changes. They've at one point been OP Death Stars. At other points in the game, they've been almost non-existent as far as a competitive place. So the question becomes, where do they fit in with the current book? Are they super competitive? Are they super overpowered? Or are they kind of lackluster? And from what I've noticed, a lot of people aren't using them in tournaments that much, in full units and stuff like that. But let's go ahead and take a look at basically the overview of what they do now. So there's two current ways to run Warlocks. One is as a single character. So you can run Warlocks as a single character and they gain the character keyword, or you can run them as a unit of multiple Warlocks. They can be taken on foot or as sky runners on jet bikes. They have access to the runes of battle, which are arguably the best psychic powers in the book. They have a decent combat ability that's, pretty good. They don't have a lot of attacks, but they have good weapons. And they're fairly tough because they have a 4+ invul save and they have an extra wound over normal infantry, normal aspect warriors, and the jet bike version has 3 wounds. So they're pretty hard to kill as far as that goes, and they have an invul save, which goes a long way. 4+ invul is very good. Not a lot of infantry units have that outside of, harlequins and stuff like that. So they are pretty tough in that way. And if you put them on a jet bike, they get an extra wound. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of their special abilities. So the first ability that jumps out at you when you're reading their data slate is the Seer Council ability, which basically means that if you have a battle-forged army, if you have a Farseer in your army, for each Farseer you can take a Warlock unit that doesn't count against your force organization. So basically allows you to take a unit without taking up a force org slot of Warlocks. And this is very useful because Eldar Elite choices are very compact, and because we typically like to run multiple small units in a lot of cases, this can help us, manage our force organization so that we can have a little more flexibility with other units that we take. So really useful for that. Anytime you can get a free force org slot that, a unit doesn't count towards a force organization, that's actually very powerful, and you can do this multiple times for each Farseer you have. So if you have 2 Farseers, you can essentially get 2 free units of Warlocks in your force organization. The next ability is the Warlock Conclave ability, which basically essentially means if you're taking a single Warlock, it gains the character keyword. So this is really good because this gives him access to all character rules, and also gives him access to probably the most important one, which is the Lookout Sir special rule, which makes him untargetable and this makes him much harder to shoot at and much harder to target in the early stages of the game when you have a lot of units on the board. And Warlocks also have access to the Runes of Battle, which means they have access to 6 powers, which actually are dual powers, because each of the Runes of Battle has a blessing and a malediction. So the first one we're going to just talk about really quick is Empower/Enervate. And if it's a blessing, you can give it to a friendly core unit, and this gives that unit +1 wound to melee attacks, which is really useful for units like Howling Banshees or Striking Scorpions or even Shining Spears to be able to wound targets much easier. And as a malediction, it gives -1 to wound basically to an enemy unit's melee attack. So this is just okay, and the reason why I say it's just okay is because it's very situational. Obviously, if you're an Eldar player, you don't want to be struck back. Whatever you charge into, you're going to want to kill. So giving -1 to wound to melee attacks only is, in my opinion, a little bit weak. This power is really mostly used for Empower. It's good as a buff. It's not so much good as a debuff because you're not really going to be struck back too often. And if they're charging you chances are your unit is probably going to die. In most cases. Not in every case, but in most cases. So it's not really that great of an ability. Now, if you are running a very tough army, like a Wraith-centric army that has a lot of Wraith Guard and things like that, I could definitely see the use of this for engaging other enemy melee troops that you know you're going to be engaged in a long slog with. Like, for example, if you have a unit of Wraith Blades with Force Shields and Ghost Axes charging into a unit of Terminators, I could definitely see the uses of this, basically, you know, negating their wound on 3+ to a wound on 4+, but most of the time it's not going to be that effective. Then we have Quicken and Restrain. Quicken allows the unit to move again, but it can't shoot or assault. A big nerf to the last edition's Quicken, which was just a free move with no restrictions. And the second part of this is actually really good. Restrain, it halves the enemy's movement and prevents action. So this makes units a lot slower on the battlefield. A unit that was going to be moving, 8 inches is now going to only move 4 inches. So really useful malediction. There's Protect and Jinx. Protect gives +1 save to a friendly unit, friendly core unit, and as a malediction, it worsens an enemy's unit save by 1. I think this is really going to be used more for the malediction now because +1 to save is really not that great on Eldar. And you can only benefit from 1 bonus. So we're mostly going to be benefiting from things like light cover and things like that. You can't get +2 from this. So you can't get +1 from light cover and then get +1 from Jinx. You can only get a maximum of +1, unfortunately. So this is a decent ability, but it's situational and only good in certain cases with tougher targets like things like Wraith Lords or Wraith Guard or things like that. It's not really great for your average Aspect Warrior. And the second part of this, though, Jinx, is very effective. This worsens an enemy unit save by 1, so basically negates the new Armor of Contempt ability that Space Marines got. And I think this is going to be a big one going forward as far as malediction goes. It's going to really help us be able to, force through that extra armor that pretty much all Space Marine players and, just units in power armor got in general. So I can see this being used a lot going forward in competitive play. We'll see what happens, but I can see this getting a lot more action nowadays just because of that buff to Space Marine power armor. Now, the next power, Conceal/Reveal, I think the conceal part of it, it just gives you a friendly unit light cover, which is +1 armor. I don't think this is that good. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's worse than Protect. But the other side of it, and this is funny, this is kind of what it is with a lot of the dual powers. One of them will be really good, and one of them will be kind of lackluster, depending on which power it is. But the second part of this, which is Reveal, is very effective. So this takes away the benefits of cover from an enemy unit. So this doesn't just negate +1 armor, this negates all cover bonuses. So it negates dense cover, it negates light cover, it negates any type of additional bonus as well that a unit might get. At least I'm pretty sure of this. I don't think there's an FAQ on it, but it says here, does not receive the benefits of cover against the attack, which in my mind, and the rule as it's written states, you're not going to receive any benefits from cover against the attack. So if a unit has something like, if this model has the benefit of cover, then it gets an additional +1 to its armor. Something like Rangers or something like that. If you use this on a unit that has a similar ability that gets an additional armor save or an additional -1 to hit, because of the fact they're in cover, they won't get those bonuses as well. So just really useful overall. Now, the next one is Enhance/Drain. And Enhance gives +1 to hit in melee for a friendly unit, so a pretty standard buff there. And the malediction side of this gives an enemy unit -1 to hit in melee. So it's pretty self-explanatory. +1 to hit for your guys, -1 to hit for an enemy unit. It's useful. It's just like the wounds. It's useful. However, I actually think this is a little bit more useful for Eldar, and the reason being is this is going to potentially negate more attacks that are coming in on you. -1 to hit is generally better than -1 to wound just because Eldar are pretty easy to wound as is. So, for example, most opponents that are melee centric are probably going to be hitting at strength 5 or greater. That means a 3+ or a 2+ to wound. But they might not necessarily be hitting that well. They might be hitting on 3+. So boosting that, or I should say negating that to a 4+, is going to actually negate a lot more potential damage than wounding rolls would in general. So, I mean, this obviously, you know, has its ups and downs, but in general, it'll help you a little bit more, I think, than negating the opponent's ability to wound you. And yeah, just a decent buff all around, and a decent malediction as well. Nothing out of the ordinary, but still effective. So the next one is kind of, in my opinion, kind of useless. Gives +2 leadership and always fights first to a friendly unit. Most Eldar units are going to be charging and are going to fight first anyway. So unless the enemy also has an ability that allows them to fight first, it's just not really going to be that useful. Now, the malediction side of this is decent because it takes -2 leadership from the enemy unit and makes that unit fight last. So this is kind of good if you know that an enemy unit is going to be charging into combat next turn. You can actually use this to make sure that unit is actually going to fight last and that your units are going to fight first. So this kind of gives you the, it's kind of funny. It kind of gives you the ability to strike before an enemy strikes, even if they charge. Technically, you can actually strike first in some scenarios with this. But it's still kind of iffy because how the rules are stated is if you charge into combat, you already strike first, right? So if you have an ability that says something like that unit is not eligible to fight this phase until after all eligible units in your army have done so, that is going to make them fight last, regardless of whether they charge in or not. So be careful when you tell your opponent this, and make sure you say that... well, basically, make sure that you state exactly what the rule says, because if you just say something casually like, oh, you always strike last, they're just going to tell you, well, no, charging units always strike first, which is true. But the rule specifically states that that unit, that eligible unit, is going to fight after all other units have already fought. So it's a little bit different. So you have to make sure you state it to your opponent in that way to avoid any kind of confusion or anything like that. So as far as the psychic powers go, unfortunately, most of the blessings cannot actually target the Warlocks themselves because they're not a core unit. They're not considered core, so those won't work on them. They will benefit from a lot of the maledictions, though. But the standout powers for me personally are Conceal/Reveal. Not for Conceal, but for the Reveal part of it, to negate any cover bonuses your opponent might have. Protect/Jinx for the Jinx portion of it. Being able to negate an armor is very powerful, especially with the Armor of Changes, or excuse me, Armor of Contempt changes. I'm going a bit Zinch here, I guess. And Enhance or Drain. So, and the reason why Drain's not really that great in my mind, but it's okay. But typically Enhance is something that's really effective on certain Eldar units because the more hits you score, the more, wounds, special wound rule, you can potentially proc. So, for example, I'm just thinking Striking Scorpions, for example, are really good with Enhance, because if they're hitting on 2s, then that means there's a far greater chance for you to roll 6s to wound and score mortal wounds and things like that. So when it comes to our melee units, a lot of them have these abilities, or, well, not a lot of them, but Striking Scorpions and a couple of others that I can think of with stratagems and things like that benefit from, 6s to wound causing extra damage and things like that. So being able to hit more means you'll have a greater chance of rolling those 6s when you actually do roll to wound. And unfortunately, +1 to wound really doesn't help too much because only unmodified 6s will proc those abilities. So for example, the Manda Blasters, only unmodified 6s will actually proc mortal wounds. So it's better to get the plus bonus to hit than to wound. Now, Warlocks do have one war gear option, and that is they can take a Singing Spear. So A Singing Spear is pretty decent, but it's 5 points. So it depends kind of what you want. We'll go over Singing Spears in a second. But what I really wanted to point out here is that Warlocks that are taken as single Warlocks have an increased cost. And I think this was to prevent spam, Warlock spam, because a lot of people would just take a bunch of single Warlocks as characters. And it could kind of become really OP with, smite spam or something like that. I think they wanted to kind of tone that down a little bit. So single Warlocks are actually increased amount of points. Now, I have a thing on this because basically what this means is that even though they are characters and can't be shot at, they have less cost effectiveness overall, and they're much harder to use this way and be cost effective. And the reason being is because as a single Warlock, it costs the same amount as 2 Warlocks on foot. This decreases durability. It may increase their ability to not be targeted by range attacks when they're within a certain range of friendly units, but it just lowers their cost effectiveness. And I really only see this being useful on Skyrunners because they're a little more efficient for the increased cost because they have the speed to prevent themselves from being isolated, and they can get to areas of the board that they need to get to. They're a little bit tougher. They have 1+ toughness, 1+ wound, and they actually do have an armor save, which means technically they can benefit from certain buffs and things like that to armor. But overall, I single models, they're useful for certain things, but they're not spammable by any stretch of the imagination because they just cost too much. And Singing Spears, as far as that war gear option, they are 5 points. They have less AP, but they have a ranged attack, and they also do a little bit more damage over Witchblades. So, they're decent, but to be honest with you, unless you're running like a unit of Warlocks, I don't really find it that effective. So, Singing Spears are a little bit iffy to me. I think there might be some potential with a unit of Warlocks on foot with Singing Spears, but I think in most cases, multi-wounded targets are going to be of a higher armor class, so they're going to get a 2+ save. It's really not going to do that much damage. And at 5 points a model, it may seem cheap, but, that's 30 points. That's an Exarch power. That's, some upgrades on your vehicles. You kind of have to think that way. I think if you have the extra points and you don't know what else to spend it on, throwing it on Singing Spears might not be a bad idea. But it wouldn't be my first choice when I'm making a list. So if I'm putting a unit of Warlocks in my list, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to field them base. I'm not actually going to give them the Singing Spears until I determine later that they have room for it in my list. And most oftentimes you'll find that you're actually not going to have room for it. And if I had to take out some points, if I had to take out 10, 20 points somewhere, Singing Spears would probably be the first place I took it out of. So I think they're kind of cool, but otherwise just not important. Now, if we look at the stat line of your basic Warlock, it's actually really insane how good it is for its points. And if you really think about it for a second, you can't put them in a Death Star anymore. They limited the number of Warlocks you can take to 6. But this actually makes it a very cost-effective battle unit. Take a look at this. It has an extra wound over Aspect Warriors. It has 1 less attack than combat-oriented Aspect Warriors. But you have a 4+ invul save. You hit on 3s still in combat. And like I mentioned, you have an extra wound. And you have the ability to cast Psychic Powers as well. So you're really getting a lot of bang for your buck here for 20 points a model. It's the same price as a Warp Spider, but you're getting a lot more value and toughness as far as your wounds count. And so when you're taking them as a unit, if you take 1, you can attempt to manifest 1 Psychic Power and deny 1 Psychic Power. Obviously, because it's a Psyker, you know the Smite power and 1 power from the Runes of Battle Discipline. If you have basically a starting strength of 4 or more, so that means if you have, I believe it is 2 or 3 Warlocks, you get an extra power to know. So it doesn't mean you can cast an extra power, but it means that you have a little more versatility when it comes to choosing which power you want to use that turn. So if you had a unit of 3 Warlocks, for example, or 2 Warlocks even, it would be a starting strength of 4. So you couldn't cast 2 powers, but you would know an extra power. And then if your unit contains 4 more models, you can cast 2 psychic powers, deny 1 psychic power. So that's pretty effective. So what this means is that for 120 points, you can have 6 Warlocks. Even if you have just 4 Warlocks, it means that you can cast 2 powers, 2 powers on the psychic table, and you can cast Smite if you really want to. So that's really cost effective. If you go with 4 models, I personally would go with 6 just for the added amount of models, because the amount of powers you cast will diminish as soon as you get below 4 models. So for example, if an enemy unit kills 3 Warlocks, you're only going to be able to cast 1 power, but you will still know 2 powers. So that doesn't change, but the amount of powers you cast will change. It'll be reduced. So I would actually take it as a unit of 6. And honestly, I mean, the Warlocks themselves aren't that bad in combat. They have 2 attacks each. They have a Witchblade, which always wounds on 2+ and has -1 armor and does 2 damage. So it's actually a pretty good weapon. Now, if we compare the Warlocks on foot and their stat lines to the Warlock Skyrunner, we'll find a very similar scenario. Now, it is plus 15 points over a regular Warlock, but you get much higher movement, you get an extra toughness, and you get an extra wound. And you do also get an actual armor save, although it's not going to be that useful. You're not going to really see it being used that much because you have the 4+ invul save. But you can occasionally benefit from light cover if in certain scenarios. Obviously not in every scenario because you're on a bike, but in certain scenarios you might be able to benefit from some, bonus to armor, so it could be useful. You have a much higher movement, obviously, so you can zip around the battlefield faster. But the biggest thing here, I think, is that the squad size is limited from 1 to 3 models, so it's much smaller. And again, I think GW, the developers of the Codex, wanted to do this because they wanted to reduce the amount of Death Star capabilities that the Eldar Codex had. Eldar aren't really a Death Star type or style of army, and they found that a lot of players were using Death Star Warlock units in tournaments and stuff like that. So I think they wanted to reduce the effectiveness of it. But even as a smaller unit, a unit of 3, or even just a single Warlock of 1, could be very effective. Now, how does this smaller unit size affect what psychic powers it can cast? Well, it knows 1 and it can deny 1, just like always. If you have 2 jet bikes, you know an extra power. So you can't cast an extra power, but you know an extra power. And if you have 3 models, you can cast 2 powers in your psychic phase. However, this only lasts as long as you have 3 models in the unit. So that means that, if you lose a jet bike along the way, then that means you can't cast 2 powers anymore. You can only cast 1 again. So I actually think Skyrunners, Warlocks are a little bit less effective because they have less protection. For example, you can put a unit of Warlocks in a transport, right? They can fit in a transport pretty easily. You can't fit Skyrunners in a transport. They're bigger, so they're harder to hide. And the extra survivability they have isn't really that much over the regular Warlocks to warrant taking them. So, toughness 4 is basic toughness. Every Space Marine has that. Wounds 3 is only just barely better than wounds 2. A lot of weapons can still easily get through that. Plasma guns, stuff like that. Anything that they would be shooting at a jet bike is going to have probably damage 2 or damage 3 anyway, like autocannons and stuff. So you really still have to hide these behind terrain all game, and I just don't think they're that effective that way. If you're running a Skyrunner, I'd actually kind of recommend that you probably just run it as a character so that it can't really get shot up that easily. The unit can't really get shot because of Lookout Sir. But in all other respects, as Psychers, it basically essentially works the same way as the ones on foot. Now, there's two different stratagems that Warlocks can actually use, and these are Warlock units. So basically, the first one here is Battle Psychers. And if you just read this for a second, basically means that if the unit contains 4 or more models, so this actually means that they have to be on foot. They can't be a Skyrunner. Manifests a psychic power. From the Runes of Battle Discipline, you can select both effects. Now, honestly, this seems awesome at first because it's essentially you're getting 2 powers out of it. But look at it more closely, right? If you actually look at the powers that Warlocks have, usually one of the powers is not going to be the best, and you might not be always in a position to use this effectively, and it costs 2 command points. So it's going to be situational. I don't think it's going to be used that often, but it is available to. It is available to you if you have a unit of footlocks that's 4 models or more. And now the other the other stratagem is Seer Council, and that's only 1 command point. You use it at the beginning of the battle before the battle starts. You select a Warlock unit that has 2 or more models, so essentially just the non-character version of the Warlocks. And while your Farseer is within 6 inches of that Warlock's unit, you add 1 to psychic tests taken for that Farseer. And while you're within 3 of that unit, enemy models cannot target the Farseer with range attacks. Wow, okay. So this makes your Farseer immune to range attacks. And I know what you guys might be thinking, well, the Farseer is a character. He has a Lookout Sir anyway. Well, this goes a bit further. This ability makes it impossible for enemies to target him with ranged attacks at all, even those that ignore Lookout Sir. Sniper rifles, things like that, cannot target the Farseer. Other weapons with the ignores Lookout Sir rule cannot target the Farseer. And also on top of that, if you hide your Warlocks behind some line-of-sight blocking terrain and you have your Farseer out in the open, people still can't shoot him because of this rule, even if that Farseer is the closest unit to the enemy, which Lookout Sir won't protect you against. So this is really, really effective. And in my mind, if you have a unit of Warlocks, there's no reason why you shouldn't take Seer Council. And a good idea would be to kind of use this on a bigger unit as well, because that means that you can get, the most out of that unit. However, you could also kind of cheese this a little bit by just having a unit of 2 Warlocks hide behind a piece of terrain and use your Farseer to jump out and kind of cast psychic powers without having to worry about being shot at. So there are a couple ways to use this. Personally, I think that the best way to use this is just as it is with the bigger unit of Warlocks. But, I've seen people be kind of effective at using this with just, 2 Warlocks. Just hide the Warlocks behind terrain. Use it to buff your Farseer's psychic power abilities and psychic powers, and then also protect him from range attacks. And so again, to rehash, the Battle Psychers stratagem isn't really worth it. I don't think it's worth the 2 command points. It's very situational, and you're not going to get much use out of it most of the time. However, Seer Council is a must-take. You have to take it. If you have a unit of Warlocks in your army, that's 2 or more, take it. It's a steal for 1 command point. You get bonuses on your psyche tests, and basically your Farseer can't be targeted by range attacks, which I believe is actually separate from the bodyguard special rule. Now, I'm going to have to double check this, but I do not think this was actually nerfed. I think that it still works in pretty much the same way. You can hide your, Seer Council behind something, out of line of sight, and your Farseer still won't be able to be charged with range attacks or shot at with range attacks. So I think it still works the same. They nerfed the bodyguard special rule for a lot of armies. They just basically gave them a worse version of it. But I actually still think that the Seer Council benefits in the same way still. Now, you might be asking, well, it seems like there's a lot of different ways to run Warlocks based on what you've talked about. So what are the best ways to use them? How should I use them in my list? So in my mind, there's really 3 ways that you can use Warlocks. So the first way is as a Warlock Skyrunner as a single character model to buff units and debuff units. So this is a unit that's going to be flying around taking advantage of the character keyword, so, being able to benefit from Lookout Sir, buffing units, casting maledictions on units. It's going to have a limited role in this, but it's not too expensive. And it's also great as a late game kind of objective capture if, it hasn't already been killed. The second way is on foot or on jet bike if you prefer, as a max unit. And basically, this acts as a really effective psyker unit that can be used to support other units in close combat, debuff enemies, and also protect your Farseer and make his casting better because of the Seer Council special stratagem. However, I have to say, I don't agree with the use of a max unit on jet bikes just because they're hard to actually, kind of protect. They're a big target. And if you even lose one jet bike, you lose the ability to cast 2 powers. And on top of that, they really don't have that many attacks. So they kind of lose their combat ability in a lot of ways. They are more mobile. They are better able to move around the battlefield, but they lose a lot of their combat potential. Remember, they have the same amount of attacks. So even though they do gain a good shooting attack, via the twin shuriken catapults, they're losing a lot of their melee ability. And I think that's the main reason why you should engage them in combat. Because even though Witchblades aren't the best close combat weapons, they are pretty good. They do damage too. They can kill Space Marines with a large number of wounds because they do wound on 2s. And lastly, the third way I think to run the Warlock unit is in small units of 2 to accompany Aspect Warriors and Wave Serpents strictly for support. So, for example, this is for something like if you want to have a Farseer on foot just kind of supporting, units in Wave Serpents, you can take a unit of 2 Warlocks, and they can actually fit in a Wave Serpent because a Wave Serpent fits 12 models. So you can have a squad of 10 Aspect Warriors and a Wave Serpent, and you can have 2 Warlocks accompanying them to basically buff your Farseer, make use of the Seer Council ability, or stratagem, I should say, and also just to kind of be there to support your Aspect Warriors with debuffs and, buffs and things like that in melee. So I think in conclusion, even though Warlocks are no longer able to kind of Death Star, basically make these really powerful, almost unkillable units, Warlocks are still very powerful and cost effective. They're very good at passing out buffs and debuffs, especially in bigger units, and they're not that expensive. They're only 20 points apiece. They have great durability for Eldar. They provide good damage. They can protect and support your Farseer, and they can deny the Witch, which is always useful because usually your opponent, will have some sort of psychic power or psychic ability, and you can use Deny the Witch to basically get rid of this or negate this. Most enemy armies are going to run some type of psyker. Grey Knights, etc., are going to have a lot of psychers in their armies, and they're going to try to basically compete with you on the psychic level. And, having a unit of Warlocks to deny this is really helpful in preventing a lot of the crazy stuff that, other army psychic abilities can do, especially with the new Tyranids coming out. I mean, a lot of their psychic powers are pretty scary. So being able to have something that can deny a psychic power, another Deny the Witch essentially, is really useful to have. So that's pretty much it for Warlocks. I'm actually really excited to use them myself. I have a couple lists with a couple of different Warlock units in it. And if you're ever, thinking about using Warlocks, they're really effective. And they're not just effective in Craftworld armies. They're also effective in Unite armies as well. So one thing I wanted to mention too before I, end the video is that Warlocks work extremely well with Yurvain. So the character Yurvain, I hope I'm saying that right, basically has an ability where if a model dies within 6 inches of her, she gets to roll a dice, and on a 4+, she gets to regain a wound. But here's the thing. If that model was a psyker, she gets to learn an additional psychic power from the Revenant psychic list. So because Warlocks are all psychers, if you have a couple of Warlocks dying in a Warlocks unit, you can just learn some free psychic powers. So it's a really effective way of maxing out your maxing out your, psychic knowledge without having to spend a bunch of points on a Farseer or something like that. So, if you're running a Unid army, really do consider using that combination. Ravain, the Vizarch, and a unit of Warlocks fighting together is really effective. And they really synergize well together, especially with the runes of battle and things like that. So I hope you guys learned something from this video. And again, thanks for watching. I'm going to try to make more content coming up. I have a couple more videos. One on the Altnazar Craftworld that came out with the supplement, which I've started to look into a little bit. And I kind of am formulating some opinions on it, but I'll let you guys know in a future video. And I have a couple more coming out as well on relics and things like that. So have a good one, everybody. I'll see you next time. Thanks. And once again, thanks for supporting the channel. I really appreciate it. And have a great rest of your day. See you later.